Minister for Foreign Affairs of brotherly Saudi Arabia. I now give the floor to His Excellency Vladimir Makei, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Belarus.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, never to forget, that was the appeal and remains one of the most important mottos of the international community after 1945. It's true, the memory of the tens of millions of victims of the Second World War, the atrocities of the Nazis and their genocide, allowed us to agree on a world order which continues to help us avoid a new global conflict. The consequence of that conflict would be catastrophic for our planet, and unfortunately, today we're closer than ever to this dangerous possibility. Among the most acute modern issues that are on today's agenda is the issue of ensuring peace and security, sustainable development, and climate change. These are the issues which are most actively discussed in all international forums. On a whole range of challenges to the international community, such as terrorism, transnational crime, drug trafficking, human trafficking, and illegal migration, there is an active attempt to find solutions. At the same time, new risks require responses. There's a growing awareness that the capabilities of any single state or even a group of states is inadequate to resolve these problems and to spare the world from disaster, whether it be military, economic, or climate. Belarus is among those states who believe that all these global challenges require effective joint solutions that are ambitious, as ambitious in scale as the problems. The key elements to such an approach are, first of all, taking part in implementing all measures by all member states of the UN, mobilizing all available political, economic, intellectual resources. The UN must also embody its role as leader in coordinating international efforts due to its universal composition and mandate. Unfortunately, we increasingly see that the multilateral mechanisms of the UN are bogged down or not functioning. They become hostages to biased approaches, mutual recriminations, or excessive ambitions. There are many cases of the use of measures that undermine the norms and principles of international law, including the UN Charter. These actions do considerable damage to a multilateral approach. There are dozens of local conflicts that are tearing the world apart, and many of them could ignite a new global war. We believe that both live conflicts and frozen conflicts should be resolved through dialogue, exclusively on the basis of the founding principles of international law, including the respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity of states, the non-use of force or the threat of force. As a result, today we're in a situation of contradictory and dangerous realities. It's clear that we need to find solutions quickly before these realities lead to disaster. I think many will agree that this is not the kind of baggage that the international community would like to mark the 75th anniversary of the UN next year. Now, the anniversary summit of the UN should give a strong impetus to trying to find these kinds of solutions. And first and foremost, it should contribute to enhancing the role of the UN in strengthening peace and security, reestablishing dialogue and trust, and most importantly, preventing the threat of a global conflict. Belarus would like to propose to the leaders who will gather here next year to dedicate their meeting to these issues. If the anniversary summit of the UN will become merely an event, another event for show, then everyone will lose. and the sinister specter of the Third World War could become a reality. As concrete measures, Belarus, for several years, has insisted on the need to move away from confrontation and resume broad dialogue on key issues of international security. This kind of dialogue would make it possible for all of us, and first and foremost the great powers, to find a path towards agreeing on how to preserve peace and jointly take up the global challenges which are constantly growing. The events of the past few months confirm that those like Belarus are correct. Those who are in favor of a new negotiating process similar to the Helsinki process of the middle of the 1970s, which would stabilize international relations and which would strengthen international dialogue and enhance predictability. Mr. President, in August, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Force Treaty was suspended. This treaty was one of the most important elements of the modern disarmament architecture and a symbol of the end of the World War. There's a real threat that these kinds of missiles with a very short flight time of several minutes could be deployed in various regions of the world, including in Europe. This could inevitably lead to an increase in tensions, a new spiral of political and military confrontation, and enhancing the risk of nuclear apocalypse. This is precisely why we're in favor of an immediate joint actions to preserve the achievements of the INF Treaty in our common home, the European continent. In the course of the International High-Level Conference, Combating Terrorism Using Innovative Approaches and Use of New and Emerging Technologies, which was held on the 3rd of September in Minsk, President of Belarus Alexander Lukashenko stated that Belarus, which was a fully fledged signatory of the INF Treaty, has not withdrawn from the agreement and does not intend to produce or deploy these missiles unless they are a threat to our security. The head of the Belarusian state put forward an initiative to develop a declaration of responsible states on the non-deployment of medium and short-range missiles in Europe. Our country proposes to start work immediately on preparing this draft declaration. We call on states on both sides of the Atlantic which care about the future of humankind to support us in this initiative. Now, the UN or the OCE could be appropriate platforms for this. A key element of this document, as we see it, are clear and firm commitments of states not to deploy in their territory short-range and medium-range missiles and not to produce them. We understand that implementing this initiative will require political determination and a complicated process of negotiation. As the old sages said, the road is conquered by the one who walks, because agreements on banning chemical and biological weapons and reducing on nuclear weapons seemed unrealistic in the past, and yet they were achieved. Ladies and gentlemen, with each year, increasingly from this tribune, we hear about the increasing role of technology in the modern world. On the one hand, we're seeing new technologies which are offering unprecedented possibilities for progress in many areas of human activity. On the other hand, there's a risk that technologies and resources will be used for criminal aims. A clear example of this are the recent attacks with the use of drones against targets of Saudi Arabia's infrastructure, which only destabilizes the situation in the Middle East even more, in particular in the Gulf. Belarus strongly condemns such actions, no matter who they are committed by. On this point, Albert Einstein came up with a nice image. He said that technological progress is similar to an axe in the hands of a sociopath criminal. End of quote. And in essence, we're at the start of a long-term global process, which already is called a technological arms race. The danger is that this race could be used both by forces of good as by forces of evil. Our aim, our task is to do everything possible to make sure that evil does not have any chance to dominate. In current conditions of tensions between countries and an increasing competition between them, cyberspace increasingly becomes a sphere of confrontation. We hear about attacks by hackers. Everything speaks of the scale of threats in this area, and at the same time there's a need for cooperation in cyberspace and increasing mutual trust. Now, speaking at the anti-terrorist conference that I mentioned in Minsk, the president of Belarus proposed forming a a coalition of good cyber neighborhood. We're talking about bilateral and multilateral agreements to ensure international information security. A key element of such agreements could be the idea of a digital sovereignty and neutrality, as well as non-interference of states in the information resources of each other. Digital sovereignty should guarantee the capability of a state to control their information domain, prevent and block cyber attacks, and ensure a reliable protection of their cyber critical infrastructure. Digital neutrality presupposes that countries will not take steps against cyberspace of other states. Ultimately, these kinds of agreements could lay the groundwork for developing international rules for responsible conduct in cyberspace. Now, as the president of Belarus vividly stated, launching this kind of wave of digital security would strengthen ties between countries. It would enhance effectiveness in combating terrorist threats and in cyberspace. Belarus is ready to cooperate in strengthening ties in the area of international information security with all countries of the world, and first and foremost with its neighbors. Mr. President, now the global economy has not been spared by the turbulence of the modern world. We're constantly seeing an increase in global trade and financial flows. We're seeing economic cooperation at the regional level increase. Well-being in various regions of the world are increasing. There are very many integration blocks. However, there are many problems as well. Political differences between countries have take the form of protectionism and sanctions. Speculation on financial markets are still rife. For a number of countries interested in joining the WTO, artificial barriers are created. The leading economies in the world are engaged in a full-scale trade war, which only take them farther away from resolving problems and increase threats of a real war. The language of unilateral coercive measures, which has no place in the UN, continues to be a reality against some countries, including against freedom-loving Cuba. All this leads to another acute problem: the unequal character of globalization. According to many estimates, it has not become the rising tide which lifts all boats. As a result, the rich get richer and the poor poorer. The potential for cooperation between regional economic blocs is not being used. Some analysts forecast that the future global order will be a world built around regions rather than based on great powers. And it's true, as life has shown us, wherever regional integration is successful, the potential for political fragmentation is reduced. We are deeply convinced that regional processes must effectively cooperate with each other. Belarus is actively participating in various integration blocs. Furthermore, over a number of years, we have always been in favor of building partnerships and ensuring compatibility of different alliances. In 2020, Belarus, as chair of the Eurasian Economic Union, plans to conduct in Minsk the first forum on SDGs. This will help countries, our partners in the Eurasian bloc, to make sure they're on the same wavelength and to exchange experience on SDGs. But it will make it possible for the region of the Eurasian Economic Union to speak with a single voice about in the global debates on implementing the 2030 agenda, discussing common problems, and at the same time underscoring the advantages of the diversity of our states. Now, in principle, Belarus believes that regional economic organizations must be actively involved in efforts to implement SDGs. They must contribute to coordinating economic policy of member states of integration blocks. This will make it possible to achieve a multiplier effect for national economies, which are the very chassis for any kind of global sustainability. Belarus is also in favor of a comprehensive dialogue on security, which could become an important contribution to overcoming the current state of geopolitical uncertainty. Mr. President, I would like to just touch upon another important topic. We are seeing that against the backdrop of a constantly increasing population on the planet, and as a consequence of an increase in the use of limited resources on our Earth, the problem of climate change is becoming more acute. Probably we're close to a point of no return unless decisive action is taken. For the time being, international efforts are lagging behind the process of climate change. The Climate Summit, which was held in the UN headquarters these days, gives us hope for consolidating efforts by the international community and to launch significant, meaningful initiatives to reduce emissions. Belarus, as a responsible participant in collective efforts to combat climate change, intends to take an unequivocal commitment by 2030 to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases by no less than 35% compared to 1990, using exclusively its own national resources. Now, providing an incentive mechanism would impart strong momentum towards a low-carbon economy. Mr. President, today the world and the UN, a year from 75th anniversary, is on the verge of an important milestone. We will reach that milestone successfully if we will find the right solutions to the challenges facing us in politics, economics, and technology. For this, we need to restore a trust at the global and regional level in international relations. We need to learn once again to be good neighbors and to together tackle the problems in our home, on our planet. Belarus is ready to continue to make its contribution within our own means in whatever format and at whatever platform, including in Minsk. What's most important is to make our world calmer, more just, cleaner, and give our people hope for peace and prosperity. Thank you very much for your attention.
I thank the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Belarus for his statement.